this episode, we focus on risk waivers, which are formal decisions to accept a specific risk when full compliance with a requirement is not achievable or not justified in the short term. A risk waiver is not a casual permission slip, and it should never be treated as a way to avoid responsibility. It is a governance action where an authorized leader acknowledges a defined risk, understands the consequences, and approves operating under that risk for a defined scope and time period. Beginners sometimes confuse risk waivers with exceptions, but a useful way to think about it is that an exception describes the gap and how it is managed, while a risk waiver is the formal approval to accept the remaining risk after compensating controls are considered. Risk waivers matter because organizations must make trade-offs, and honest trade-offs require decisions that are visible, accountable, and traceable. Without a disciplined waiver process, organizations either stop necessary operations unnecessarily or quietly accept risk without leadership awareness, which is dangerous and unethical. Our goal is to explain how to obtain authorized risk waivers properly, including how to frame the request, how approvals should work, and how records must be maintained so the organization can prove that acceptance was deliberate and appropriately governed. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong risk waiver process begins with clarity about authority, because acceptance is only meaningful if the approver is empowered to accept the risk on behalf of the organization. In practice, authority depends on governance structure, risk appetite, and the impact level of the risk. High-impact risks affecting regulated data, critical services, or legal obligations typically require senior-level approval, because the consequences can be organization-wide. Lower-impact risks may be approved at lower levels, but still require clear delegation of authority. Beginners often assume that a manager's approval is enough, but if that manager does not have authority to accept the potential consequences, the waiver is not valid governance. Clear authority prevents a common failure mode where waivers are approved by convenience rather than by appropriate accountability. It also ensures that leaders who are responsible for outcomes are aware of the risks being carried. A waiver process that respects authority protects the organization because it ensures risk acceptance decisions are made by those who can weigh business trade-offs and allocate resources. When authority is unclear, risk waivers become fragile and can be challenged during audits or after incidents. Before seeking a waiver, the organization must define the risk precisely, because vague risks cannot be accepted responsibly. Precision includes what requirement is not met, which systems or processes are affected, what data is involved, and what the specific exposure is. It also includes the conditions under which the risk exists, such as certain user groups, certain environments, or certain operational states. For beginners, it helps to understand that risk is not a general feeling of insecurity. It is a specific chance of harm tied to specific conditions. A precise risk statement supports meaningful evaluation by leadership. It also prevents waiver sprawl, where a waiver intended for one narrow situation is used as a general excuse for broader noncompliance. Precision helps ensure the waiver is scoped and time-bound, which is essential for responsible governance. When risk is defined clearly, it becomes possible to decide what compensating controls are reasonable and what residual risk remains after those controls are applied. A waiver request should also include context that explains why full compliance is not currently feasible or not currently justified, because leaders need to understand the constraint, not just the risk. Reasons might include technical limitations in a legacy system, vendor constraints, operational mission needs, or resource limitations that require staging improvements. The reason should be factual and should avoid implying that compliance is optional. It should also include what has been considered, such as alternative solutions, timeline options, and potential impact on operations. Beginners sometimes treat a waiver as a shortcut, but a mature waiver request demonstrates that the organization has evaluated options and is choosing the best available path under real constraints. This helps leadership see that the waiver is part of a controlled strategy rather than a sign of poor discipline. Context also supports audit defensibility, because auditors often want to see that decisions were reasoned and that the organization is not ignoring requirements without justification. A well-framed request shows intentional governance. Compensating controls are central to a responsible waiver because the organization should reduce risk as much as practical even when full compliance cannot be reached immediately. A waiver request should describe what controls and workarounds are already in place and what additional controls will be implemented to reduce exposure during the waiver period. These might include narrowed access, increased monitoring, additional approvals, limited scope of use, or temporary process changes that reduce likelihood and impact. The request should also describe how these controls will be verified, because controls that exist only on paper do not reduce risk in reality. For beginners, the key idea is that a waiver is not acceptance of maximum risk. It is acceptance of residual risk after reasonable safeguards are applied. Leaders are more likely to approve a waiver when they can see that risk is managed actively rather than ignored. Compensating controls also protect the organization ethically because they demonstrate a commitment to harm reduction even under constraints. Residual risk must be stated honestly because that is what leadership is actually approving. Residual risk is what remains after compensating controls are considered, and it should be expressed in terms of realistic outcomes, such as increased chance of unauthorized access, delayed detection, increased data exposure, or increased operational disruption. It should also include potential compliance consequences, such as audit findings, contractual impacts, or regulatory exposure if an incident occurs. Beginners often struggle here because they want certainty, but risk statements should be honest about uncertainty while still being decision-ready. The key is to describe plausible scenarios and impacts without exaggeration. This allows leaders to compare the residual risk to the business need for continuing operations under the waiver. If the risk is high, leadership may decide the waiver is unacceptable and require alternative approaches or increased investment. If the risk is moderate and time-limited with strong compensating controls, leadership may accept it with conditions. Honest residual risk statements build trust, because leaders learn that the security team is not hiding uncomfortable truths. A proper approval process includes more than a signature, because approval should reflect informed consent to the risk. Informed consent means the approver understands scope, duration, residual risk, and conditions, and that the approval aligns with organizational risk appetite. Conditions might include deadlines for remediation, periodic review requirements, limits on use, or mandatory reporting of incidents related to the waive control. Approvals should also identify who is responsible for implementing compensating controls and who is responsible for monitoring compliance with waiver conditions. For beginners, it helps to see waivers as conditional agreements, not blank checks. A waiver that lacks conditions tends to become permanent by inertia. A waiver with clear conditions creates accountability and a path to closure. Approval should also include recognition that circumstances can change, meaning the waiver may need to be revoked or revised if risk increases. This conditional structure makes waivers defensible because it shows ongoing governance rather than a one-time excuse. Traceable records are the backbone of a credible waiver program because traceability proves that acceptance was authorized and that the organization can manage waivers as an inventory rather than as scattered emails. Traceability means the organization can show the waiver request, the risk statement, the compensating controls, the approval decision, the approval authority, the dates, and the conditions. It also means linking the waiver to the requirement it affects, the system it affects, and any related exceptions or remediation plans. For beginners, the key lesson is that traceability protects everyone. It protects the security team because it shows they raised the risk and sought authorization. It protects leadership because it shows decisions were deliberate and informed. It protects the organization during audits and after incidents because it demonstrates governance discipline. Traceability also supports review because the organization can see which waivers are nearing expiration, which are high risk, and which have been outstanding too long. Without traceable records, waivers become hidden risk that no one can manage effectively. Monitoring and review are the final steps that keep waivers from becoming permanent risk debt. A waiver should have an expiration date or a review date, and the organization should have a routine for revisiting whether the waiver is still justified. Reviews should confirm that compensating controls are still operating, that scope has not expanded, and that remediation progress is on track. If conditions are not met, the waiver may need escalation, additional safeguards, or removal. For beginners, the key idea is that risk acceptance is not a one-and-done event. It is an ongoing decision that must be renewed based on current reality. Monitoring also helps the organization identify patterns, such as recurring waivers in the same control area, which may indicate systemic issues that require investment. When waivers are monitored and retired appropriately, the organization reduces long-term exposure and strengthens its compliance posture. A waiver program that never closes waivers becomes a museum of unresolved risk and eventually undermines credibility. Obtaining authorized risk waivers with proper approval and traceable records is the discipline of accepting necessary residual risk openly, responsibly, and with accountable governance. You begin by ensuring approval authority is clear, because risk acceptance is valid only when it is made by leaders empowered to own the consequences. You define the risk precisely, explain why full compliance is not currently feasible, and document compensating controls that reduce exposure during the waiver period. You state residual risk honestly so leadership can make an informed decision, and you structure approvals with conditions, scope limits, and deadlines to prevent waivers from becoming permanent by default. Traceable records link waivers to requirements, systems, and remediation plans so the organization can manage waivers as an inventory with visibility and control. Ongoing monitoring and scheduled reviews ensure conditions are met and waivers are retired when no longer justified. When waivers are handled with this discipline, the organization maintains operational flexibility without sacrificing integrity, and it builds a compliance program that is credible, transparent, and resilient under real-world constraints.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.